Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels, and in this video, I'm sharing a card I created with the beautiful Kaleidoscope collection from 49 and Market. I've added a touch of distress and grunge to it with a mix of various mediums, including texture paste, luster wax, and paint. Now let's get on with the making. So to get started, I selected several papers from the Kaleidoscope 6x8 paper pack, and I'm just going to trim them down to size. The finished card size that I'm going to be doing is an A6, which is 4.5 by 6.25 inches in size. And here I'm just using my paper trimmer to trim those down because I'm going to do 3 different layers. The kind of teal color is going to be the base layer, and then the print paper here is going to be the middle layer, and then the pink is going to be the top layer. And then I'll have enough scraps left over here to either create another card front or use for some other project. So I'll definitely hang on to those. So before I even started on the card, I went through the embellishments from the Kaleidoscope collection and the teal collection, because those both coordinate really nicely together. And I picked out some pieces from the Kaleidoscope laser cut elements, the chipboard set, and the chipboard words. And then I also picked out a frame from the teal frame set. And I played around with how I wanted to position those on the card. And it was really a lot of trial and error. This part of the process is always one that takes me a little longer than the rest of it. Just kind of playing around, trying to get things in what looks pleasing to my eye. And, you know, I kind of started off with an idea of what I wanted the card theme to be. This particular card, I had my niece in mind who's going to be graduating from high school this year and going to be here very soon. And I just thought the sentiment, always chase your dreams and dream big, were just a good fit for that theme. So now for the background, I am working on that pink piece of pattern paper, and I've selected 2 different stencils that I thought I would like to work with, and both of these are kind of a small, delicate pattern. So as far as selecting some sort of stencil to work with for your project, you know, just look for something that's just more delicate and small, because that would just kind of fit more with the scale of a card. And I'm also going to be working with Distress Texture Paste Matte, so any sort of texture paste would work though. But before I start with any of that, I'm going to apply a layer of gesso to the surface. I'm working with a white gesso, so this is going to cover up a lot of that pink and kind of tone it down, but I do kind of water it down a little bit with some water. And then I'm just using a brush here to apply it to the paper. And of course, I realize that I needed a little bit more here, so I just add a little bit more. And then once I get the paper covered with a nice thin layer, then you can either set that to the side to dry, or you can dry it with a heat tool just to kind of speed up the drying process. Between the 2 stencils, I think I really like the way this scroll stencil where it looks. It's just a little bit more delicate, and I just felt like it went better with the design. And now I'm getting ready to use some Distress Texture Paste, and I'm just applying that with a palette knife. And I'm going to position the stencil here in the upper left-hand corner, and then I'm just going to apply just a thin layer of it kind of just to this upper corner here. I'm not going to fill in the entire stencil. And you might have noticed that plastic stuff that I pulled out of the container. That's just a piece of press and seal, and I've been using that to kind of minimize the pastes from drying out. Seems to be helping a little bit, but they will eventually dry out if you don't use them. So gotta use our stuff. So now I'm gonna move the stencil over to and put some into that bottom right hand corner. And just repeat that process of applying some texture paste here. And then once you're finished with applying the paste, then you just want to make sure that you either have a pan of water near you that you can put the stencil in just to keep it wet until you have time to clean it off, or go and clean it off right away. Just, you don't want that paste drying on there. And yeah, and then just set this paper to the side to dry. You can also use a heat tool to speed up the drying process if you like. So now that the background is dry, I'm going to apply some Distress Spray Stain. I'm going to be working in a splat box, and this is just a cardboard box that will just kind of help protect my work surface from the spray. And I've got a paper towel on the bottom of it that just helps soak up the extra ink. And I'm going to just kind of spritz the colors into the corners in the areas where I had the texture paste. And the colors I'm working with here are Saltwater Taffy and Worn Lipstick. And then I'm going to spritz these with a little bit of water just to get that ink moving. And I'm going to add a little bit of some Kitsch Flamingo, just a little bit brighter pink, and just to kind of help brighten it up a little bit. And I'm going to add a little more water. And I'm going to dry that then with my heat tool. And the reason I used the gesso earlier to protect the paper was because of these spray stains, because they would otherwise just like soak right through the paper, and they just wouldn't hold up to all these mediums that I've layered on here. So the gesso will help with that quite a bit. Once the paper is dry, you can continue adding some other colors if you like, or more color, which is what I'm going to do just to kind of continue to brighten it up a little bit. I'm adding a little more of that Kitsch Flamingo and a little more water, and then drying that again with my heat tool. And you can just continue that process until you're happy with how it looks. And here's kind of how it looks at this stage. And if you've got any of the paste that's like hanging over the edge there, you can just use some scissors to trim that off if you like. And here you can kind of see the back of the paper, and the ink is still soaked through even with the gesso. So I maybe need to get a little bit more gesso on there, but I still had enough on there to protect the paper that it didn't like fall apart with all those mediums on there. So now what I'm going to do is distress the edges of the paper, and to do that, I'm going to be using the back side of a craft knife or an X-Acto knife, whichever you prefer. And you just want to make sure before you start this that the paper is completely dry, because if it's still wet, the paper is just going to tear. And so yeah, so just make sure that's super dry. And there are other tools out there, there's distressor tools and stuff. I just find using the back of the craft knife just more comfortable to hold on to than some of the other tools that I've tried. So that's just really a personal preference. Once the distressing is finished, I'm going to ink the edges. And for this, I'm going to use some Vintage Photo Distress ink. And I start with that first, and that's just because it's a dye ink and it's a little more translucent. And then I decide I wanted maybe just a little bit more intensity, so I add some Distress Oxide in the same Vintage Photo. So you could definitely do one or the other, but if you're going to layer distress inks and oxide, you always want to put the distress ink down first and then the oxide, because if you try to go the other way, the distress ink is a dye ink and the distress oxide's pigment and dye combination, so it's a little more opaque, and so it will kind of cover up anything that's underneath it. So that's why you would want to do it last. Once I get the ink all around the edges, I'm just going to spritz that a little bit with my distress sprayer filled with water, and then dab those droplets dry to kind of lift off some of that ink. And here is what the background looks like at this point. And then you can either set that to the side to dry or use your heat tool to speed up the drying process. So now I'm going to work on the backgrounds, and before I do anything else, I'm going to distress the edges of this text print paper, again using the back side of my craft knife. And once I get all the edges done there, I'm going to apply some Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink to the edges of it, just to give it a little bit of a distressed, a little bit more of a grunge effect. And I'm going to do the same thing with the teal paper as well. And now I'm going to move on to the different embellishments, and I'm going to ink the edges of those with some Vintage Photo Distress ink. And here I'm just using a tiny blender tool, and I'm just going to apply that ink to the edges of all of the different little die cuts to just kind of give them a little bit more of a vintage feel. Some of these little pieces I'm going to distress a little bit more. So here I'm just taking those little stamps and kind of bending them to create some creases and then inking them, and then that just adds a little bit more interest as well. And now for that chipboard frame, I'm going to use a distress hammer, and I'm just going to kind of hammer around the edges just to distress them and give it a little bit more of a aged effect. And then I'm going to take a sanding disc, which is just a piece of fine grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to sand around the edges, which will kind of remove some of the printed design and reveal like a white below it, and again just kind of adds to that distressed effect. And then once I'm finished with that, I'm just going to wipe off the dust from the sanding, and then I'm going to finish this off by inking the edges of it with that Vintage Photo Distress ink as well. Now I'm going back to the pink background paper, and I'm going to add some splatters with Scorched Timber distress paint. And so I'm just going to put a little drop of that here on my craft mat, add a little bit of water, and then I'm just going to use this kind of long thin paintbrush to pick up the ink and splatter it over the background. And then I can use my heat tool to dry that, or you can set it to the side to dry, either way. And so here's a look at the background so far after adding the splatters. Next thing I want to do to add just a little bit more interest to the background is I'm going to apply some Sizzix Luster Wax in rose gold. And I prefer to wear some gloves when I'm working with this medium, just because it's just a little bit difficult to clean off your skin. So, when I work with it, I like to kind of just pick up some of it onto my finger and then rub that around in the lid to kind of get it even coverage onto my finger. And then I can just kind of keep my finger flat and then just rub over the surface of the area where I had applied that texture paste. And so then the wax then is going to adhere to that raised area and just give a little bit of shimmer and shine. And then I just kind of keep working and adding that until I'm happy with how much I've got on there. And here you can see, so it just adds just a tiny little bit of shimmer to the background, which I think is just really pretty. So now I'm going to start assembling the card, and for this I'm just using a liquid adhesive and layering those various papers together. And then I'm going to add the frame and the other various embellishments, and I'm going to add a little bit of foam tape to the back side of the teal frame. And this is just 1 millimeter thick tape, so it's really pretty thin, so it doesn't add a lot of extra bulk, but it still gives you just a little bit more dimension than adhering it flat to the background. And now I'm just gonna play around with all of the other little ephemera die cut pieces and figure out where I want to position them. And kind of as I mentioned earlier, this is always like a process for me, just kind of playing and figuring out the positioning of things. A lot of times I kind of think about how, kind of creating like a bit of a visual triangle with colors. So like if I've got pinks, kind of spreading them out so that they're in a triangle with each other. And the same with like that kind of a light peach color there. And yeah, so just, it's really just a process of kind of playing around, seeing if it works. In fact, I actually glue this stuff down and then decide I want to move it. And thankfully I'm able to peel it up before it's completely dry and kind of play around and reposition it to where I'm finally happy with everything. Here I'm using a stamping block to kind of add kind of as a paperweight to just kind of hold those die cuts down in place while the adhesive dries. And then I'm adding the sentiment here with a little bit of foam tape just to pop that up just a little bit and kind of finish it off with that last little Dream Big chipboard piece. And there we have it. So here is a look at the finished card with the distressed mixed media background that I created using the texture paste and the spray inks and paint splatters. Then you can kind of see all of the dimension I created with the frame, the chipboard pieces, and the laser cut elements. Thanks so much for stopping by today. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.